The harbor woke to a hush that felt rehearsed by the sea. The ship slid from the mist like a memory that refused to speak. Captain Elias watched, jaw tight, as damp gray light bled over the pier. Captain Elias said, "She flies no colors." First Mate Harrow said, "No wake, no voices, only wood and weather." The villagers crowded close, their wool coats dark with dew and worry. Nets dripped along the pilings like tired flags, and gulls circled without a cry. Ropes hung from the ghost ship's yards like veins from a long silent heart. Captain Elias said, "We will board when she's moored." First Mate Harrow said, "If she lets us." The sea tasted of iron and old storms, as the hull eased alongside, a cathedral of salt and silence. The mariner's wraith had returned, but her men were swallowed by whatever quiet owned this dawn. The harbor master uncoiled a line with hands that remembered funerals. Captain Elias said, "No one goes below until I say." First Mate Harrow said, "Aye, Captain." The villagers pressed closer, drawn by fear and spectacle. The ship's hull kissed the fenders with a hollow thud that echoed like a door closing. Riggers tossed hooks and caught nothing but air until the wind leaned in to help. Captain Elias said, "Heave together." The line grew taut and sang, and the vessel answered with a weary groan. Salt stung the ears like whispers that would not form words. The silence on the deck felt curated, as if someone had tidied absence into an art. When the gangplank slapped against the rail, the sound was sharper than any shout. They smelled the ship before they boarded, a tang like blood thinned by rain. Captain Elias said, "Masks on." First Mate Harrow said, "Aye." The harbor master handed canvas masks as if handing prayers. The gangplank complained under boots, a tired creature forced away. Captain Elias said, "Eyes forward." The deck greeted them with a film of salt and a dusting of ash that did not belong to the sea. Ropes coiled in shapes that looked rehearsed by a stranger's hands. First Mate Harrow said, "Tools undisturbed." Captain Elias said, or rearranged to look so. The wind failed, and the flags said nothing. The wheel stood lashed amidships, a sailor's knot tight enough to outlive its maker. Captain Elias said, "Who tied you, and why?" The compass card floated off center, as if sulking. First Mate Harrow said, "No log on the stand." A mug lay on its side, stained by a ring of salt and thyme. Captain Elias said, "They left in order or in panic well practiced." The bell hung with its clapper wedged, silenced by a sliver of wood. First Mate Harrow said, "No alarms then." The air tasted like boiled coins. A gull landed and refused to cry, as if bribed by the hush. They found the first message carved where a helmsman might rest his hand. Captain Elias traced the grooves with a gloved finger. Captain Elias said, "Not weathered." The words read like a verdict unfinished. First Mate Harrow said, "Letters cut in a hurry, but true." The phrase stopped at a splinter, as if the blade refused to continue. Captain Elias said, "Find the log, find the cook, find any clock that still remembers." The ship creaked, answering with language older than men. Somewhere below, a hatch breathed and shut itself. First Mate Harrow said, "She has a pulse." Captain Elias said, "Then we will ask its heart." The hatch groaned as if reluctant to share its secrets. Captain Elias said, "Lanterns lit, slow and steady." First Mate Harrow said, "Mind your steps." The air from below was colder, wet with the breath of deep water. The lantern flames quivered, as if sensing they were unwelcome. Wooden steps dipped under their weight, sighing in protest. Captain Elias said, "This ship keeps her story close." Shadows pooled in the corners, thick enough to hide men or memories. First Mate Harrow said, "No rats." The silence felt intentional, like it was waiting to choose its moment. The smell of salt gave way to something sweet and wrong. The crew's quarters lay in careful disarray. Hammocks swayed faintly though no wind reached them. Captain Elias said, "No signs of struggle." First Mate Harrow said, "No signs of life either." Tin cups rested upright as though waiting to be filled. Boots stood neatly at the foot of each hammock, their leather cracked but dry. A deck of cards lay mid-hand, untouched. Captain Elias said, "Whatever happened, it happened all at once." First Mate Harrow said, and without warning. The silence clung to the canvas walls, heavier than the damp air. In the galley, a pot of water sat half full, its surface coated in a thin skin of salt. Captain Elias said, "No fire for days." First Mate Harrow said, "Yet it hasn't dried." Knives hung in their racks, blades clean and dry. The smell of the place was faintly sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. A loaf of bread on the table bore a single bite, its crust hardened like stone. Captain Elias said someone stood here, then didn't. First Mate Harrow said, and left everything breathing but themselves. The lantern flame guttered, but there was no draft. They reached the captain's cabin, its door ajar. Captain Elias said, "A ship's heart lies here." The desk was bare save for a closed logbook and a brass compass. First Mate Harrow said no charts. Dust motes danced in the light from a single round window. The bed was made, but the pillow bore the shallow depression of a head recently lifted. Captain Elias said, he left knowing someone would follow. The logbook creaked as Elias opened it, the first page inked but incomplete. The last word was found. The hold was colder still, the lantern light shrinking against its depth. Captain Elias said, "Cargo's all here." First Mate Harrow said, but untouched. Crates sat sealed, barrels dry on the outside, but cool to the touch. A single crate lid lay pried open, revealing straw but no contents. Captain Elias said, something was worth leaving behind everything else. The air tasted metallic again, and faint condensation clung to their brows. The lantern flame dimmed once more, and this time it did not recover until they climbed back up. The night wrapped the ship in thicker fog than the morning had offered. Whoa! Captain Elias stood on the deck, lantern in hand, watching the mist curl like smoke around the mast. Captain Elias said, "She breathes when we are quiet." First Mate Harrow said, "And holds her breath when we move." The rigging ticked faintly, like bones settling. Somewhere far below, a sound pulsed once, deep, resonant, and gone. Captain Elias said, "We're not alone aboard." The lantern's glow seemed to dull, as though the fog drank the light. Harrow's eyes shifted to the rail, following something unseen. The ocean itself lay still, like black glass stretching to the horizon. They followed the sound to the forward hold, boots thudding softly on damp planks. Captain Elias said, "Keep the light high." The hatch here was heavier, iron-banded, and warm to the touch despite the cold air. First Mate Harrow said, "Something's been kept here." The hinges whined as they pushed it open. A coil of chain lay on the floor, its links damp and faintly steaming. The air smelled of salt mixed with copper. Captain Elias said, "This is no place for cargo." Harrow's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the shadows that clung like cobwebs. The logbook returned to Elias's hands, pages whispering under his gloves. By lamplight in the captain's cabin, he read aloud entries that began with weather and ended in fragments. Captain Elias said, August 14th, "We heard it again." Harrow leaned in. Captain Elias said, August 18th. "It's below, waiting." The handwriting sloped into something urgent, then stopped entirely. The last page was torn, edges curling like burnt paper. Harrow said, "Someone didn't want the ending written." Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows. They decided to search the bilge, where the lowest water and darkest corners met. Lantern light flickered over brackish pools between the ribs of the ship. Captain Elias said, "Mind the beams." Harrow crouched, touching the water. It was icy, yet the timber beneath was warm. First Mate Harrow said, "That's not right." A ripple formed where no drip had fallen. Elias's lantern swung slowly, the reflection in the water stretching unnaturally long before snapping back. Captain Elias said, "Back up now." Back on deck, the fog had shifted, curling in patterns like script. Captain Elias said, "It's moving against the wind." Harrow stepped closer to the rail, peering down at the black water. Something glimmered faintly beneath the surface, too still to be a fish, too large to be debris. First Mate Harrow said, "It's watching." The fog closed in again, hiding the glow, and the air fell so silent they could hear their own hearts. Captain Elias said, "We stay topside until dawn." Dawn broke reluctantly, the light pale and thin as if the sun itself feared the deck. Captain Elias stood at the bow, eyes narrowed at the horizon. Captain Elias said, "We ride her out to open water." First Mate Harrow said, "To what end?" The gulls were gone, their absence louder than their calls. The sea was unnaturally smooth, the sails hanging in limp defiance of the morning breeze. Elias's boots creaked as he moved, the sound echoing where it should have been swallowed by open air. The ship felt heavier than her tonnage, like something unseen rode within her hull. They set course away from shore, the harbor vanishing into the fog behind them. Captain Elias said, "Let her show us where she wants to go." The compass needle wavered and then locked on a bearing that pointed into emptiness. Harrow said, "We'll be chasing shadows." The wind began to rise, but only ahead of them, never at their backs. The Wraith leaned into it like she knew the path by memory. Beneath their feet, a faint thrum pulsed through the timbers, steady as a heartbeat. By midday, the fog thinned enough to reveal a dark shape in the distance. Captain Elias said, "Another vessel." Harrow raised a spyglass, his brow furrowing. First Mate Harrow said, "She's listing. No sails, no crew." The ship ahead was smaller, its hull scarred and weather-bleached. As they drew closer, its name came into view, Mercy. Elias said, "She was reported lost last winter." The Mercy drifted broadside, rocking gently as though cradled by unseen hands. They came alongside, ropes ready but unused. Captain Elias said, "No boarders, look first." The Mercy's deck was a twin to the Wraith's, silent, untouched, yet heavy with unseen presence. Harrow said, "Same absence." The wheel spun once on its own, then stopped abruptly. Elias's jaw tightened. Captain Elias said, "They met the same fate." The water between the two hulls darkened, shadows writhing just beneath the surface. Without warning, the Mercy's bow dipped as if pulled from below. Wood groaned, ropes strained, and a low vibration shuddered through both ships. Captain Elias said, "Cut us loose." Harrow swung the axe, severing the line just as the Mercy lurched. The abandoned vessel tilted sharply, then slid beneath the surface with a single final sigh. The water closed over her without a ripple, leaving only the silence behind. Harrow's knuckles whitened on the haft of the axe. First Mate Harrow said, "That will be us if we linger." The Wraith surged forward under wind that touched no other patch of sea. Captain Elias stood at the wheel, his hands gripping the spokes as if holding back a flood. Captain Elias said, "She's running from something." First Mate Harrow said, "Or toward it." The horizon ahead thickened into a wall of cloud, black-veined and slow-moving. Lightning flashed inside it, but no thunder followed. The water beneath them changed hue, deepening to a green so dark it looked like the skin of an old bruise. Elias's knuckles whitened as he kept her steady. The storm's edge broke over them without warning. "Wind you." Rain lashed sideways, stinging skin and drumming on the deck like fists. Captain Elias shouted, "Reef the sails." Harrow and the remaining hands moved fast, their boots slipping on soaked planks. Lightning tore open the sky again, showing a shadow far larger than the Wraith moving beneath the surface. Harrow said, "There." But the darkness was gone before Elias could look. The wind shifted suddenly, slamming into the sails from the opposite direction. The Wraith lurched hard to port, throwing water over the rails. Captain Elias yelled, "Hold her steady!" Harrow fought the wheel beside him, the rope screaming in protest. A wave rose taller than the mast, but instead of breaking, it curved around them like a wall. For 6 heartbeats they sailed inside a moving tunnel of water before it collapsed back into the sea. The storm passed as abruptly as it had come, leaving the deck steaming under a sudden shaft of sunlight. The horizon was empty in all directions. Harrow's chest heaved, rainwater streaming from his hair. First Mate Harrow said, "We're nowhere, I know." The compass spun lazily, unable to choose. Captain Elias said, "We go by the wind now." But the sails hung limp, and the air felt like the moment before an inhale. As the sun lowered, they saw it, a dark spire of rock rising from the ocean, jagged and alone. Captain Elias said, "Chart shows nothing here." Harrow said, "Yet here it is." Birds circled high above, but made no sound. The water near the base was darker still, almost black, and no waves touched the stone. Elias's voice dropped. Captain Elias said, "We anchor here for the night." But the anchor rope paid out and never struck bottom. Night fell in a single breath, the spire now a jagged shadow against a sky emptied of stars. The Wraith drifted forward, though her sails hung dead. Captain Elias said, "Hold her steady, Harrow." Harrow moved to the rail, eyes on the still water. First Mate Harrow said, "We're not moving by the wind." Elias's brow furrowed. Captain Elias said, "Then what's pulling us?" The reflection of the spire stretched across the water, bending unnaturally far. Harrow leaned over the side. First Mate Harrow said, "That's no reflection, Captain, it's moving." A low vibration thrummed up through the planks. Elias pressed his hand to the rail. Captain Elias said, "Feel that? Like a heartbeat, not ours." Harrow swallowed, voice taut. First Mate Harrow said, "It's under us and it knows we're here." Elias's jaw clenched. Captain Elias said, "Then let's find out what it wants." The longboat slipped into the water without a splash. Elias took the oars, the wood groaning softly. Captain Elias said, "No noise but what we make." Harrow cradled a lantern, its light barely touching the surface. First Mate Harrow said, "She looks bigger out here." Elias's eyes stayed locked on the looming shape. Captain Elias said, "Bigger and older." The spire's surface was slick, veins of pale mineral catching the faint light like buried lightning. Harrow squinted. First Mate Harrow said, "That's not stone, I know. Feels grown, not built." The hum deepened, rippling through the oarlocks. Elias paused his stroke. Captain Elias said, "Hear that rhythm? It's like a voice without words." Harrow shifted uneasily. First Mate Harrow said, "Feels like it's speaking right through my ribs." Elias dipped the oars again. Captain Elias said, "Then we'd better listen." The base of the spire swallowed the lantern's glow before it could touch bottom. Elias said, "We'll go around it." Harrow's gaze clung to the slick black surface. First Mate Harrow said, "Captain, look there." The overhang was carved with spirals and lines that bent the eye if stared at too long. Elias leaned closer. Captain Elias said, "These weren't made by tide or time." Harrow's voice was almost a whisper. First Mate Harrow said, "Feels wrong to read them, like they're reading me." The boat rocked gently. Elias froze, listening. Captain Elias said, "Something brushed the hull." Harrow's hand went to the side. First Mate Harrow said, "It's warmer under the water than above it." Elias nodded slowly. Captain Elias said, "Whatever's down there knows we found its door." They rounded a bend to a cleft in the rock wide enough for the boat. Elias slowed his stroke. Captain Elias said, "We go in." Harrow hesitated, lantern trembling slightly. First Mate Harrow said, "It's glowing from underneath." Green light pulsed upward through the black water, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Elias's voice was low. Captain Elias said, "This is no place for a ship to be born." Harrow's oar struck something solid. It shifted away soundlessly. Harrow's eyes widened. First Mate Harrow said, "Captain, that wasn't stone." Elias's jaw set. Captain Elias said, "We're in its mouth now, Harrow, and it knows we're here." Harrow swallowed. First Mate Harrow said, "Then maybe we should leave before it closes." They backed out slowly, the glow fading as the spire slipped behind them. Elias climbed aboard the Wraith first, scanning the horizon. Captain Elias said, "It's following us." Harrow froze, mid-step. "First Mate Harrow," said the hum. Elias nodded. Captain Elias said, "Still there. Fainter, but it's ours now." Harrow peered over the rail. The water shimmered faintly, green threads winding in their wake. First Mate Harrow said, "It marked us, Captain." Elias's voice was grim. Captain Elias said, "Or claimed us." The sails shifted overhead without a whisper of wind, their canvas sighing like lungs filling. Harrow's eyes tracked the movement. First Mate Harrow said, "It's breathing with us now." Elias's gaze stayed on the spire's silhouette fading in the dark. Captain Elias said, "Then we'll see where it leads." Dawn broke without warmth. The sky, a pale, bruised sheet, over a sea that pulsed faintly in rhythm with the Wraith's timbers. Captain Elias gripped the wheel, his knuckles bone-white. Captain Elias said, "She's steering herself, Harrow. I've no pull on her." Harrow stepped closer, peering at the still sails. First Mate Harrow said, "No wind, no tide. We're moving all the same." Elias's gaze locked on the horizon, where a faint shimmer bled into the sky. Captain Elias said, "She's drawn there, as if she knows the way home." Harrow frowned, voice low. First Mate Harrow said, "And we're passengers on our own deck." The glow beneath the water thickened, coiling under the hull like veins of light. Elias spat over the side, eyes narrowing. Captain Elias said, "Whatever's beneath us, it's alive." Harrow's jaw tightened. First Mate Harrow said, "Or it's the dead, Captain, and they've been waiting." The hum below rolled through the ship, rattling nails, whispering through the rails. Elias's eyes hardened. Captain Elias said, "Then let them speak." The glow beneath them led to a patch of water that churned without wind, slow spirals deepening the surface. Elias's eyes tracked the swirl. Captain Elias said, "Heave to," but she won't listen. The wheel spun without resistance. Harrow's voice was tense. First Mate Harrow said, "Captain, she's already listening to someone else." The Wraith slowed as if answering a call. Elias leaned over the rail, eyes narrowing. Captain Elias said, "What do you see?" Harrow's face drained of color. First Mate Harrow said, "Shadows. Dozens, maybe hundreds." Elias gripped his arm. Captain Elias said, "Men?" Harrow shook his head slowly. First Mate Harrow said, "Shapes, but not as we are. Their edges move like smoke underwater." The ship trembled, planks creaking. Elias's voice was steel. Captain Elias said, "We keep our heads. They want us looking too long." Harrow swallowed hard. First Mate Harrow said, "They're circling and waiting for us to decide." Without warning, the surface broke. A towering figure, carved of water and shadow, rose beside the Wraith, its form shifting but always watching. Elias's breath caught. Captain Elias said, "Crew of the Wraith, is that you?" The figure leaned closer, faceless yet somehow intent. Harrow's eyes darted to the depths. First Mate Harrow said, "Captain, look below." The sea under the figure churned, releasing more shapes, human outlines drifting upward. Elias's voice cracked. Captain Elias said, "By God, it's them." Harrow's voice was a whisper. First Mate Harrow said, "Their eyes, they glow like the spire." Elias's hand trembled on the rail. Captain Elias said, "They never left her." One of the forms brushed the hull, its hand dissolving into spray before reforming. Harrow stepped back instinctively. First Mate Harrow said, "They're touching her like she's theirs again." Elias said quietly, "Perhaps she always was." The hum deepened into a resonant chord that made the rigging tremble. The ghostly crew moved in a slow circle around the Wraith, their faint green eyes locked on the living men. Elias stood tall, voice steady. Captain Elias said, "You've brought us back to them, Harrow." Harrow's grip tightened on the rail. First Mate Harrow said, or them back to us. One of the shapes rose high enough for its face to meet Elias's. He recognized the features of a man he'd buried at sea 5 years ago. Captain Elias said softly, "Matthew." The figure only tilted its head before sinking again. Harrow pointed to the prow. "First Mate," Harrow said. "They want us in the current." The wraith began to drift toward the spiral, ropes creaking though no hands pulled them. Elias didn't move to stop her. Captain Elias said, "She belongs to them now." The wraith slid into the spiral as though welcomed home. Elias kept his gaze on the center. Captain Elias said, "Steady, Harrow. Don't fight her." The sea around them rose in walls of green-lit water, closing out the horizon. Harrow's voice was tight. "First Mate," Harrow said, "Captain. I can hear them, not with my ears." Elias nodded slowly. Captain Elias said, "They're speaking to your bones." The hum became a heartbeat, ancient and slow. Harrow closed his eyes. "First Mate," Harrow said, "it feels like going below decks after a long voyage." Elias smiled faintly. Captain Elias said, "We're home." The green light swallowed them whole, and the wraith was gone. No wreck, no ripple, only the endless calm sea. The whisper of that hum faded until it was part of the ocean itself.